In Amish culture, sons inherit the farm and provide the physical labor a working farm requires. When a family has 5 daughters and no sons, every assumption about how that farm survives has to be rebuilt from the ground up. Here is exactly how that happens. Why Amish families expect sons. Amish farm life is built around an assumed division of labor. Sons work alongside their father, learning to plow, plant, harvest, and manage livestock. Daughters work alongside their mother, learning to cook, sew, and manage a household. Inheritance customs reinforce this division. Land traditionally passes to sons rather than daughters, and to the youngest son rather than the oldest. This system depends on at least one son being born into the family. Most Amish families with 7 to 10 children have several sons among them, making the system function smoothly without anyone needing to plan for an exception. 5 daughters and no son. When a couple has 5 daughters and no sons, the exception becomes the family's permanent reality. The first daughter's birth is celebrated normally. By the third and fourth daughter, the father may begin to wonder privately whether a son will ever arrive. By the fifth, the family has accepted that this is simply how their family will be composed. The Amish do not view this as a tragedy. Every child is received as a gift from God, regardless of gender. But the practical reality remains. A farm that always assumed a son would inherit the property now has 5 daughters and no son to fill that role. The labor reorganization. The father cannot simply wait for a son who is not coming. The farm work must be done regardless of the gender of the children available. Starting when the oldest daughters are old enough, around age 10 or 11, the father begins teaching them tasks that would normally go to sons. A daughter who shows aptitude for handling horses learns to handle horses. A daughter who can lift effectively helps with hay bales. The household chores get redistributed. Some daughters spend more time in the barn and field. Others spend more time in the kitchen and garden. The family finds its own balance based on each daughter's strengths. Daughters doing boys' work. By their teenage years, 2 or 3 of the 5 daughters in this family are doing work that would typically be done by sons in a family with male children. They milk cows before sunrise. They drive teams of horses during planting and harvest. They handle the physically demanding work of hay baling, fence building, and barn maintenance. This is not considered improper or scandalous within the family or the immediate community, though it is noticed. The girls themselves often take pride in their capability. They have grown up doing this work, and they are good at it. Their hands develop the same calluses, and their bodies develop the same functional strength that sons in other families develop. At the same time, they have also learned the domestic skills every Amish girl learns from her mother: cooking, sewing, preserving food. The daughters in this family end up with a broader skill set than daughters in families with sons, because they were never permitted the option of specializing entirely in domestic work. The farm needed their labor, and they provided it. The father's adjustment. The father's relationship with his daughters develops differently than it would have with sons, though the difference is more in texture than in substance. He teaches them the same skills he would have taught sons. He relies on them for the same farm tasks, but the language of that teaching shifts. He cannot speak to his daughters the way he might speak to sons about taking over the farm someday, because Amish inheritance custom does not typically pass land directly to daughters while sons exist. Since no sons exist in this family, the father must think through the inheritance question differently than he ever expected to. He works alongside his daughters daily, building the kind of close working partnership that fathers and sons typically build. But he carries an awareness that the eventual disposition of the farm will require a decision he never anticipated needing to make. He does not express anxiety about this openly. Amish men do not dwell publicly on uncertainties, but the adjustment in how he plans for the farm's future is real and ongoing throughout his daughter's adolescence. Community perception of an all-daughter family. The community is aware of this family's unusual composition. 5 daughters and no sons is uncommon enough to be noticed, though not so uncommon as to be considered remarkable in a population with no birth control and family sizes that vary naturally. Neighbors and church members generally respond with practical helpfulness rather than pity or judgment. Other farmers in the district occasionally send their own sons to help with tasks that require more hands than the family currently has available, particularly during planting and harvest seasons when extra labor matters most. This assistance is offered the same way any community assistance is offered in Amish culture, without being asked and without creating a sense of obligation. Some community members privately wonder how the farm's inheritance will eventually be resolved, but this wondering rarely becomes direct conversation with the family. The Amish community generally trusts that families work out their own internal arrangements according to their specific circumstances, and a family with 5 daughters and no sons is understood to be navigating a situation that requires flexibility the standard customs were not built to address. The inheritance question. As the daughters reach their late teens and early 20s, the inheritance question becomes pressing. The standard Amish custom of passing the farm to the youngest son cannot apply because there is no son. The alternative custom, less common but established within Amish tradition, is that the farm passes to the youngest daughter when no son exists. This practice, sometimes called ultimogeniture when applied to the youngest child generally, exists specifically to handle situations like this one. The father begins thinking concretely about which daughter and which future son-in-law might be positioned to take over the farm as his own retirement approaches. This is not a decision made unilaterally or announced formally years in advance. It develops gradually as the daughters marry, and as it becomes clear which marriages position a couple to remain near the farm and take an interest in continuing its operation. The youngest daughter, still unmarried while her older sisters begin their own households, becomes the most likely candidate by default, since she is the one still present on the farm as the question approaches its resolution. Why the youngest daughter inherits. The custom of passing the farm to the youngest daughter when no son exists mirrors the logic of passing the farm to the youngest son in families that do have sons. The youngest child remains at home longest, has the most direct ongoing relationship with the parent's daily life and the farm's daily operation, and is positioned to provide care for the parents in their old age in exchange for inheriting the property. In this family, the youngest daughter has spent her entire childhood and adolescence working the farm alongside her father, since there were no sons to do that work instead. She knows the land, the animals, and the operation as thoroughly as any son would have known them. When she marries, her husband effectively steps into the role that would have been occupied by a son who married and brought a wife into the family operation, except the direction of integration is reversed. He joins her family's farm rather than her joining his. This reversal is unusual, but not unprecedented in Amish culture, and it solves the practical problem of farm continuity that the absence of sons created. Choosing the right son-in-law. The selection of the youngest daughter's husband carries weight beyond ordinary courtship considerations because this marriage will determine who operates the family farm for the next generation. The father pays close attention to any young man who begins courting his youngest daughter, assessing not just his character and faith, but his aptitude for farming and his willingness to take on an operation that he did not grow up working. A young man who has grown up on his own family's farm and is accustomed to that work, but whose own family has other sons who will inherit that property, is often a strong candidate. He brings farming competence without bringing competing inheritance claims. The courtship in this situation carries an implicit negotiation that both families understand without it ever being stated as a formal arrangement. If the young man and the daughter marry, and he proves capable and committed to the farm, the transition of operational responsibility from father to son-in-law happens gradually over years, the same way it would happen between a father and a son, just with the relationship established through marriage rather than birth. How the legacy continues. The farm that began with a father and 5 daughters and no sons ultimately continues through the youngest daughter and the husband she chose, specifically because he could take on that responsibility. The 4 older daughters, married into other families and other farms or trades, maintain their connection to the family home through regular visits, especially as their parents age and eventually move into the addition built onto the farmhouse for retired parents, a building addition recognizable by its different colored siding that marks farms across Amish settlements. The grandchildren who grow up on that farm carry the bloodline of the original family, even though the surname running the operation may differ from the surname the farm was originally established under. The Amish do not consider this a break in legacy. The land continues to be farmed by people connected to the family who built it. The work ethic and farming knowledge developed by the daughters who filled in for the sons their family never had gets passed down to their own children and to the children of the daughter who inherited the farm with her husband. The legacy is preserved not through a direct male bloodline holding the deed, but through the practical continuity of family connection, shared faith, and the land itself remaining productive and occupied by people who care about it the way the original family did. What the older daughters carry. The four older daughters who eventually marry into other families carry something with them that most Amish women do not possess to the same degree. A genuine working knowledge of farm operations that goes beyond what they would have learned simply by growing up near a farm with brothers handling the heaviest tasks. When these daughters marry men who farm, they are not passive partners standing at the edges of the agricultural operation. They can step in and manage livestock if their husband is injured or away. They understand equipment, planting cycles, and animal health in ways that give them genuine voice in farm decisions rather than deferring entirely to their husband's judgment. Husbands who marry these daughters often discover, sometimes to their surprise, that they have married a woman who can run the farm competently in their absence. This becomes particularly valuable during harvest emergencies, livestock health crises, or any situation requiring immediate practical knowledge rather than waiting for the husband to return. The daughters themselves rarely discuss this capability as anything unusual. They simply absorbed it the way children absorb whatever skills their specific family circumstances required, and they carry it forward into their own households as a quiet but significant asset. How the mother's role shifted. The mother in this family experienced her own significant adjustment alongside her husband's. With 5 daughters and no sons, she did not have the option of raising some children purely for domestic work, while her husband raised others purely for farm work. She found herself managing a household where her daughter's time was divided between learning from her and learning from their father in ways that shifted year by year, depending on what the farm needed most urgently. During planting and harvest seasons, she might lose 2 or 3 daughters to field work for entire days, leaving her to manage cooking, laundry, and younger children's care with less help than a mother in a family with sons would have had, since those sons would have been entirely absorbed into farm work rather than splitting time between 2 domains. She adapted by teaching efficiently, by training her daughters to complete domestic tasks quickly during the windows when they were available, and by accepting that her household would run somewhat differently than her neighbors' households. She never expressed frustration about this publicly. She simply built a system that worked for the family she actually had rather than the family the standard customs assumed she would have. What happens when an Amish family has 5 daughters and no sons is a story about flexibility within a culture that values tradition deeply but values practical survival even more. The standard customs assume sons will be available to provide farm labor and eventually inherit the property. When that assumption fails, the family does not abandon its farm or its way of life. The father teaches his daughters the skills he would have taught sons. The daughters take on physically demanding work alongside their domestic responsibilities, developing a broader range of competence than they might have needed otherwise. The community offers practical support without judgment. And when the time comes for the farm to pass to the next generation, the established alternative custom of passing it to the youngest daughter provides a path forward that the Amish system was already prepared to accommodate. The young man who marries that youngest daughter steps into a role within the family that mirrors what a son would have occupied, bringing his own farming competence into a family structure built around 5 sisters who grew up doing whatever work their farm required, regardless of whether tradition assigned that work to their gender. The farm continues. The family legacy continues.